Trump and his administration are kind of dinosaurs and not accepting the obvious, which is pretty shocking that we are now behind the UAE and Saudi Arabia in terms of climate change initiatives. You're listening to A Climate Change. This is your host, Matt Matern. I've got a great guest on the program, Paasha Mahdavi. He is an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara of political science. He's the co-founder of the 2035 Initiative. He's the director of the Energy Governance and Political Economy Lab, non-resident fellow at the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, and author of Power Grab. So welcome to the program, Paasha.
Oh, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, tell us a little bit about, I always like to go back to origin stories of how did you kind of come upon the climate as being your issue? And, what was your journey?
Yeah, no, I love these because it also forces your own self to go back in time and keep thinking about things. You get somewhere and you're like, what was I thinking 30 years ago? And for me, it really did start like 30 years ago or even a little bit more. Because, my interest kind of emerged as a kid. And it really is the story of two sides of my family. My father's younger brother, my uncle, was a metals and commodity trader. He worked in Iran, at the time, the Soviet Union. He taught me about like the magic of all the things that we as humans extract from the ground, like how amazing it is that we can do this stuff and what we can use it for. But on the other side, my mother's two older brothers, so two more uncles, they were pioneers in solar thermal technology. And they taught me how you can tap into kind of the seemingly endless supply of power from the sun. So I became fascinated with the idea of what could be like an infinite fuel. Like, how could we get energy from something and not have to put energy in to get it? And my uncles, these engineers and business people were like, you can't do that. But I became fixated with this idea. In between them was kind of this untold story of how it's also about politics and economics and how that shapes how people use energy and natural resources. And so when I went to college, and later grad school, I learned how markets and governments, in short, what we call political economy, is as important, if not more important, than engineering or physics in determining how we as people, humanity, harnesses energy resources.
Yeah, certainly we've got an example of it with the Carter administration back in the late 70s saying, hey, because of the oil shocks and the oil embargo of the late 70s, we as the U.S. want to shift away from oil and, put solar panels on the roof of the White House and, was exploring all kinds of alternative fuels. And I recall reading that in the National Geographic as a teenager and thinking, oh, this is really cool. And then when Reagan came in, he took all the solar panels off the White House, shut down all the research on those areas or lots of it. And we changed. We shifted back towards the focus on oil. And so that was a political decision when it certainly would have been a wiser decision to start transitioning to a renewable fuel posture back at that point in time. And it wasn't, as you said, all science. It was politics that drove the direction of the country. And we're seeing that kind of type of shift right now. This is from the Biden administration to the current administration.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And in fact, this gets at another part of my, my origin story too, because, in college, I was an economics major. And this is actually that was when I really started to get into the climate crisis in particular. So I took an economics class and I thought it was going to be about globalization. And in fact, the title was Globalization and Its Risks. It was taught by Professor Graciela Chichelniski at Columbia, and she's still teaching there. And I thought it was going to be about trade and markets, but they were like, no. The biggest risk is climate change and how economic growth is leading straight towards catastrophic climate change. And this was a couple years before Al Gore kind of popularized the catastrophic climate change kind of phrase in Inconvenient Truth. And why did I raise this? Because, then I thought, okay, maybe maybe it's not just the science, maybe it's the economics. But then it became clear that it wasn't just the economics either. It's this intersection, right, of how economics can be used to study both energy and how we can avoid the climate crisis, but also the political story, which is, as you know, with the Reagan example, like that is just clear cut a political case as you can get. Even if, as we see now, even if there are economic advantages to clean energy, there are certainly political ways to make those advantages disappear. And so the policy and political process is really what drove me to become a political scientist, which is, the hat I wear today.
Well, tell us a little bit about your work outside of the classroom in terms of you founded the 2035 initiative. Tell us about that initiative and why you founded it and how is it going?
So that's been a really fun project that I've been able to lead with the two other co-founders, Leah Stokes and Mano Mildenberger here at UCSB, in addition to 13 other faculty here that are, interested in the politics and political science side, both climate and environmental regulations and things like that. We set this up to be kind of a think and do tank. We wanted to merge the research that we were all doing, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the stuff that I'm doing on the oil and gas climate politics side. Make that research accessible and directly informing kind of policy and the public broadly. And so we created this vessel to do that, to really make research have the kind of quick impact on both the policy process and just getting it out there in via public communication. And so it's a blend of things, really, of the very long time scales that we have when we do research as academics and the short, action needed items on any given policy issue or any given public matter. And so how do we kind of find that happy medium? And that is very much what we try to do. We're about 2 years in. So and as you can tell from our title, we have an end date. We really want to tackle issues that are imminent. So between now and the year 2035.
So what are those goals?
We have a couple of pillars that we look at in particular. And we had started this by thinking of this three-pillared approach. One of them is to think about what are the kinds of politics and policies we need to address to ramp up clean energy, if we're thinking about clean energy taking over as a way to mitigate climate change. The other is thinking about policy pathways towards phasing out fossil fuels. So those two are both especially focused on mitigation. And the third goal is thinking about adaptation and thinking about all of the issues related to the current and future climate impacts that we are facing. So what are the kinds of adaptation style policies and things that governments can do or should do or try to do to adapt and respond to climate change? So that's our guiding star, as it were. It's this triangle sort of, and thinking about what our ultimate kind of aims and how our research fits in to this space.
I guess as you were talking, I was thinking of what about reduction of energy usage and efficiency? And is that part of your strategy as well?
Absolutely. So, the efficiency part of the story, which is the topic that is, for whatever reason, the least sexy of anything, but is incredibly powerful, is baked into these first two pillars. So when we think about ramping up clean energy, a lot of the story is also about improving energy efficiency, right? Trying to replace things or retrofit or do what we need to do to improve our basically productive use of energy, right? So using energy more effectively, more efficiently. And so that would be also more cost effective. So that's a big part of the first pillar. And it's also a huge part of the second pillar, which is where, I firmly fit in thinking about, oil and gas in particular. And energy efficiency there means a lot of things. A big part of it is reducing the emissions that you get from the production process, trying to basically clamp down on any existing inefficiencies if we're continuing or as we continue to consume, right, and produce oil and gas. How do we improve efficiency on that side? So it's baked in there, but it always goes unnamed, but of course, it's this huge part of the story.
Well, as talking to a lot of smart folks or in the last 4 years on the podcast, one of the topics that they bring up is the methane emissions, and the oil and gas industry are big emitters of methane. And the Trump administration has, I guess, gone in the direction of kind of reducing the regulations on the emissions of methane. And what are your thoughts there as to, are there ways to counteract that type of public policy shift?
Well, you're talking to the right people, Matt, because, methane is a huge part of the story. There's some studies that suggest that, human-made methane emissions are responsible for 1/3 of the warming that we're seeing today since the Industrial Revolution, right? And yet it's not, the top of line thing. We're so focused on carbon dioxide. And just as a, refresher for, your audience, who I'm sure already knows a lot of this stuff, listening to the awesome interviews you've been doing, that methane, the reason it's a problem, you think about it atmospherically, it's a greenhouse gas that's 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in trapping heat over a 20-year time frame. So it's 80 times more potent. That's a huge thing, from at the molecular level. So we've really got to do something about it. Now, oil and gas contributes roughly 1/3 of man-made methane emissions, right? The rest is ag and landfills. So it plays a big role. It has often been called the low-hanging fruit in the policy realm. Why? Well, one, it's pretty much limited to just a very small number, relatively speaking, of point sources. It's different than thinking about carbon dioxide that's coming out of cars, airplanes, ships, and so on, right? A lot of the sources can be tracked down. And there's an element there of a concentration, which is an easier political problem. The second is that groups like the International Energy Agency like to project that half of the emissions, methane emissions that are going off unabated right now, could be fixed not only at no cost, they actually can be a net positive cost. In other words, capturing that methane is cost efficient because you can then sell that methane. Why? Because methane is the primary ingredient of natural gas. So if you capture it and find a buyer, not only have you solved the climate problem in terms of letting this thing not go up into the atmosphere that's really trapping a lot of heat, but you can sell it. So if half of the problem is solvable from an economic standpoint, like, why aren't we doing it, right? So that's why we get the low-hanging fruit. We should be able to do it. We're not doing it. So your point about Trump is the answer, right? Why aren't we seeing action on methane? We're seeing methane emissions keep rising even before the Trump administration came in. And you have these two political challenges in particular. Monitoring, which we can come back to, because that's a really, really important part of the problem. And then enforcement, which is really about how you make regulations and try to effectively incentivize a reduction in emissions. So the story with Trump right now and his administration is that, we had this methane fee in the Inflation Reduction Act passed under the Biden administration. We also had Biden's rules around methane, the Quad O rules, as they're called, that were executive orders. Those two things, the methane waste emissions charge in the IRA and the Quad O rules, are basically two of the pieces that have been gutted very effectively by the Trump administration. And the waste emissions charge, which was in the IRA, is one of the pieces that was cut relatively quickly. Now, lots of the IRA is still there. There's a lot of IRA defense being played, but it couldn't work here on the waste emissions charge, which basically said, if you're emitting a lot of methane, you're an oil and gas producer, you have to pay a fee above a certain amount, right? And so kind of like a carbon tax, but just for methane. And of course, that fell by the wayside. Why did it fall by the wayside? Well, the answer is really a story of kind of intra-industry dynamics, that larger firms were already quite supportive of this because they were doing it. They were reducing their methane emissions. But smaller firms, independents, shale producers, a lot of them were not. And it was costly for them to go out in the field and figure out where the leaks were coming from, fix the leaks, and so on. So they adamantly pushed against it, and they ultimately won. So it was an interesting battle between the well-known household names like Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, and a lot of the smaller folks who weren't doing the methane abatement work already. So they wanted this law gone. So that's a bit of the political story.
So you also are the director of energy governance and political economy at Lab. What is the work that you do there?
So a lot of the work we look at is within the context of the oil and gas sector, and we are thinking about how the intersection of economics and politics, how that intersection can tell us about the impacts of oil and gas, not just on government outcomes. So there's the governance story, but also thinking about the climatic impacts, as well as thinking about the kind of loop, as it were, the effects on the economy, and therefore those effects on politics. So a couple areas of interest here. I mean, one is trying to think about how oil and gas historically has impacted political institutions. And so one kind of through line there is what some people call the resource curse, which is this idea that you have oil and gas, that should be a great thing for your country because you can extract it and sell it, and therefore you get more money. But it turns out that that's not the case. And not only that, you end up getting worse political outcomes, more instability, weaker institutions, in some cases, more authoritarianism and things like that, and conflict. So that's one area that we look at, is kind of what are these impacts of oil and gas and having oil and gas on kind of the core political elements, the governance parts of things. The other is thinking about, the role of corporations. And this is split in between multinationals that are investor owned, as well as companies like state-owned enterprises, like national oil companies. What are their roles in climate politics and policy? And what are the kinds of research that we can do to better elucidate those impacts? And so that's a couple of the pieces that we do, but it's all kind of framed within this perspective of this intersection between oil and gas, extractive resources, and kind of the political economy issues, how those things are affecting politics, how those things are affecting the economy.
Well, it's kind of fascinating. As you were first talking about this, I was thinking of Ecuador, which I think has sworn off, drilling more wells for petroleum, and it's kind of the reverse of the drill baby drill scenario. And you think of that as a bold move, and certainly a world leader. And then also you were talking about kind of the petrostates, and or at least that's what came to mind when you were talking about national oil companies. And I went to COP 28, and surprise, surprise, the oil petrostates were kind of on board with the idea that their products are causing global warming. They didn't seem to be fighting against that, which is kind of fascinating that the Trump administration is behind the petrostates in terms of, like, do you think that those petrostates would not, would be accepting that their product is committing or causing global warming if it wasn't? They certainly had the money to fight that. And yet they all seem to accept the reality of it. And Trump and his administration are kind of dinosaurs and not accepting the obvious, which is pretty shocking that we are now behind the UAE and Saudi Arabia in terms of climate change initiatives.
It's a huge area because you have very different rhetoric that national oil companies and these countries that are so reliant on fossil fuels. And I'll talk a bit about national oil companies in a minute, because Ecuador is an interesting case on that too. It's interesting how different the rhetoric can be between the U.S. and these other countries, but you've also got a lot of variation within the countries that are producing fossil fuels and how they are tackling the problem. So it's worth stepping back a little bit to think about this issue, because we should give a sense for the scale here of the problem, and also kind of who are the actors, as it were. So if we think about, I mentioned this term, kind of national oil companies, a bunch of times. These are these state-backed entities, government-owned companies that are in charge of a country's oil and gas production, and sometimes they go international. These companies, NOCs for short, national oil companies, they manage about half of the world's global oil and gas production. They own about 60% of the world's global reserves. The other thing is the historic number of greenhouse gas emissions is kind of important to think about, that since 1965, right around when most countries were nationalizing oil and gas, these NOCs account for 35% of all global cumulative emissions. Like 35%, that's everything, including all other sectors, but you can trace back 35% of all global cumulative emissions to these national oil companies since 1965. And yet they're not household names. These are companies like Saudi Aramco, like the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. You mentioned the UAE, Pemex in Mexico, NIOC in Iran, Gazprom, which has now become more of a household name, the state-owned gas company of Russia. So why do I mention these? Well, because, at COP and in other places, these companies and their kind of connective tissues within the political system, the ministries of energy and so on, these companies have such a large role in a country's finances in places that are rich in oil and gas. They are huge employers in these countries. And that's an interesting paradox, because oil and gas is not, a labor intensive industry. It is a capital intensive industry. But because of their, size on multiple fronts, these national oil companies play a tremendous role in shaping politics in their home countries and abroad at COPs. So, this is, I wrote a book, and this is the one you alluded to at the start, called Power Grab, that was all about why we create, leaders have created national oil companies in the first place, how they become instruments of political survival and things like that. And so, these companies are, sometimes the mouthpiece, sometimes the face to a lot of petrostates in international arenas, and they're saying different things. And so to get to your question, it's kind of a long and winding road to get there, but because there's a lot of complexity here. Some of them see the writing on the wall, which is that if they continue to double down their country's assets, right? This is investments, tax dollars, and things like that into oil and gas, that this is not a viable long-term strategy for economic growth. Part of that is just their own geological decline. Part of that is a sense that there is some longer-term acceptance of a transition by some. And so why, as a country, would you put all of your chips into this particular bucket? Now, others don't see it that way. And, Saudi Aramco, which is the state-owned company of Saudi Arabia, sitting on, one of the world's largest reserves of oil and gas, they just don't see the energy transition happening very quickly, if at all. They don't see oil and gas really going anywhere, at least not for them. And so they want to be what people like David Victor call the last man pumping. They will continue to pump forever until nobody will buy oil at any quantity. Why do they think they can do that? Well, because they have really, really cheaply extractable oil. It costs them about $6 a barrel. Even if you include shipping and processing and all that, that's really, really cheap. And they have a lot of it. And if you think about what the world may need in 2050 or 2070 or 2100, there's still some, oil demand. They think they will be the suppliers because they can do it cheaply. So that's like an economic story of comparative advantage. But the ones who don't, and they have to think about how not to strand their countries. This is a term that people like David Manley and James Cust have thought about, which is not to become a stranded nation. And because they are the stewards of their country's resources, there is a sense of saying, well, look, we can't keep doing this forever. We have got to do something else at some point. And so you have there a sense of, the different perspectives, the different time horizons of different countries, the different sense of their competitive advantage. And now you start to get an understanding of why it's such a weird kind of quilt, as it were. And then you have the US that's, one of the few countries that never nationalized. And so it's never really thought about, oil and gas in the context of a single entity that is the steward of a country's natural resources. And so it just comes at it from a very, very different perspective.
Well, we have a lot of different dynamics in play, and one of them is the rise of the electric vehicle and China being able to produce them now at scale at lower prices. And my understanding is that their consumption of oil in the transportation sector for the first time is going down after decades of increasing kind of exponentially, which they were sucking up every barrel of extra oil that could be found, which kept prices going up. And now they're kind of leveling off and maybe starting to decline, which, could be huge, particularly if Europe and the US are also going in this direction where there'll be less oil used for transportation. It could drop the price of oil, which will hurt the marginal producers. And, maybe you could talk to us about where you see that going.
Oh, yeah. This is such a good point to raise, right? And this gets to the kind of nitty gritty of thinking about the kind of break-even prices or kind of the cost curve, as it were, for the global oil and gas industry. And if we're starting to see a slowdown in Chinese demand and other Asian country demand, if we're starting to see a ramp down in general in consumption because of potential changes to the market. You're thinking about tariffs and their impacts, and coming up as we have the summer season coming up. So as the oil price goes down, because you're going to maybe have continually high supply. We had an announcement from OPEC earlier this week that was saying, look, we want to go back to increasing. We want to make up for production cuts and try to lots of inner OPEC dynamics there as to why they might be thinking about increasing output, especially Saudi Arabia. What does that mean? You got lots of supply and decreasing demand. So it doesn't take more than Econ 101 to suggest that the price may go down. So who does that affect? Well, kind of the biggest impacts are going to be actually felt by a lot of oil and gas companies here in the United States, where you think about shale producers. You think about producers in aging contexts like we are here in California. A lot of people don't know that our history is very, very deeply intertwined with oil. We've been producing oil here for 140 years. So a lot of our wells are not quite that old, but a lot of our wells are old, and so costs a lot more money to extract. So as you start to see $50 a barrel oil, right now we're about 60, 63. As you start to go down and down, right, that's going to make it uneconomical for a lot of producers in the United States to produce, right? And that's true of a lot of these national oil companies as well. Companies that don't sit on the cheapest reserves, places like Nigeria, places like Mexico, right? I talked about Pemex. I mentioned them earlier. What is their future going to be if we're starting to see already some dents in demand, and if there's a long-term downturn in demand for oil and gas products, irrespective of a recession, but thinking about now the longer-term energy transition? What are they going to do? Right. And so it becomes then a very clear economics story. And it's like, well, do you produce and sell at a loss? You just can't do that for very long unless you really think things are going to turn around again. But if you're Saudi Arabia, you're like, I'll still be making money. It's really got to come down really low for me to lose money. And same with, the UAE, they'll keep producing. And so that's kind of the story there.
And in the 80s, Saudi Arabia, whether intentionally or unintentionally, kind of crushed a lot of oil producers by tanking the price down to like $10 a barrel. And it maybe caused the downfall of the Soviet Union in its consequence. And they could kind of do the same thing to the Russian economy right now, because if they ramped up production and dropped the price of oil pretty dramatically, the Russian budget would take such a hit and the Russian economy would take such a hit that it would be pretty dramatically bad for Putin's government, as well as for some other governments like the government of Venezuela and Iran and others that are very, based on their production of oil.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And this is this interesting this is where you start to merge both the markets, thinking about, break-even prices and how that impacts companies, and then thinking about it from a government's perspective. What's a government's break-even price in terms of their commitments, of their expenditures? How do you run a country, right? And so, lots of people have tried to nail down the numbers, right? Like, what does the price of oil need to be for, the Russian government to continue to, make on its obligations or deliver its promises? And, while there's uncertainty in that number, and it's true that a lot of Russian oil can be produced cheaply. There's lots of Russian oil that can't be produced cheaply, right? And so it does put a squeeze on anyone who can't be cost competitive. And at a certain point, you can't win that fight with places like Saudi Arabia because, and the UAE and the other Gulf, you're just not going to be able to compete, right? And so they have put that squeeze on before. And I'll say the other thing, which is kind of an interesting story of that's all too familiar, and this is where the resource curse comes back in, which is that these are the classic boom and bust cycles. And it's one thing for a boom and bust to affect an individual company. It can clear the marketplace, companies that weren't as efficient before, and then they regroup and then they grow. When you talk about a country, you're talking about the lives of millions of people. And playing that game is a gamble. And this is where you try to get out of that trap and not pin your entire economy on something that already has natural boom and bust cycles, like the 80s, and the fact that so many countries, including the Soviet Union, were impacted by that decision by Saudi and a few others to flood the markets with oil. So it's worth kind of pointing that out. And it's a game that if you're the leader of a country, you really are gambling with people's lives.
Well, certainly a lot of the oil companies and the smaller ones in the shale space and in Texas who've made tons of money are upset with the Trump tariffs because it has lowered the heat of the US economy and the world economy, which has lowered the price of oil. And so they are getting hit. And so they're no longer kind of willing to go along with drill baby drill because the price of oil is going down. So those are long-term investments. And if you feel like, hey, if I'm only going to make $60 a barrel, it may not be worth the investment to pump this oil at whatever cost it might be.
Well, that's absolutely right.
Well, I guess part of this just boils down to economics and can alternative energy beat fossil fuels on the playing field in economics and just pure economic terms. And to a certain extent, it is with solar and wind producing electricity at lower rates than coal and natural gas. The question is, will the Trump administration quash those efforts to allow them to compete and tilt the playing field towards coal and towards natural gas, so it'll make it more difficult to have the wind and solar industries win? And also, will these tariffs on that affect solar and wind projects, will they tank a lot of projects that could go forward? And I guess related to the IRA, will these tariffs affect all the nascent American companies that are trying to be competitors in the production of solar energy manufacture and wind energy manufacturing, which are kind of reliant upon Chinese products to kind of make their finished product? That's a lot, but you could probably go on for an hour with that one. But
no, I mean, now a lot of people will say that indeed for a lot of these clean energy applications that, building a new power plant, for example, building a new renewable power plant, like a solar plus battery, is cheaper, right, than building a new coal plant. It's also faster than building a new gas plant right now. We've got a really long gas turbine backup. So if you want to put new power on the grid, you might have a better shot at doing so by going solar plus battery than going gas, right? Because of the impacts, not just tariffs, but also thinking about the gas turbine marketplace. So, that there is truth to that in terms of the cost of energy. The other thing, though, that always, this is the thing that drives me nuts, is that if you're a company and you have to think about a long-term kind of economic, business plan, and you want to make sure that you have a lot of certainty over your energy costs, right? Why would you stick with a fuel that has remarkably known volatility? Like I was saying before, booms and busts are, central to the oil and gas industry. They have been for over a century and a half, right? I mean, the days of the early oil industry and price volatility is something else. But this is a commodity, when we think about fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, that has a lot of volatility. If you can lock in something that doesn't have that volatility, why wouldn't you do that? And that is an economic argument for renewables. And the one thing we haven't talked about so far is geothermal. And that's this interesting space right now where you have a lot of appetite by the Trump administration because of Chris Wright, the head of the DOE, and Trump himself kind of advertising for or really pushing for next generation geothermal. Why is this a big area? Well, it has a lot of things that are adjacent to the oil and gas skill set. There are a lot of actual sites, old oil and gas wells that you can use for geothermal energy storage. And this is the kind of thing, electricity wise, that can be appealing to the rise of kind of data centers that are going to need lots of energy going forward, right? Thinking about, again, longer term business plans. So, why wouldn't you try to lock into something like that rather than try to hook yourself to natural gas, which has this known price volatility? So, the volatility is an important piece of it on top of all the stuff you were saying before, Matt, which I agree with, which is that in a lot of applications, it's just cheaper to not use fossil fuels. And even if you try to unlevel the playing field, it's still cheaper, right? And so there's lots of advantages because we have dramatically improved our ability to generate electricity from renewable sources. But there are going to be hiccups along the way. And, we've got lots of issues on the supply chain, for example. We've also got interconnection queue issues. So it's like you build a new solar plant, when will you connect it? There's all of that still needs to be addressed. But that's just as true for other new plants as well. So the playing field issue is a big one. But the thing that is sadly going away, right, is that the playing field is not level, right, already. And the kind of remarkable amount of subsidy that has gone to the oil and gas industry is something that, politicians love to ignore. But if you start to remove those, then you can really see how truly level the playing field is in favor of renewables. So that's a whole other can of worms, but it's an important note for people thinking about, well, it's not just like, this product is not subsidized. It is indeed. And that's a story not just here, but kind of globally.
Well, you're seeing some pushback as to ESG policies, and a lot of the big companies are kind of scrubbing that off their websites and to be in alignment with the current administration. So, kind of where do you see that going, particularly with the mega companies, the Mag 7 type companies that had pretty, I guess you'd say, progressive environmental policies and trying to go greener? Where do you see that headed? And can corporate America and corporations across the globe clean up their supply chains so they're not using products from dirty industries?
It is a thing, right? And it is something that we are seeing with kind of the withdrawal of a lot of companies, from some earlier commitments that had been made because of the backlash to ESG. But a big part of it is just thinking about, well, what are the smart strategies a company can make thinking long term, right? And so part of that story is, again, back to these economics, what are the kinds of things you can do to try to reduce your long term costs? The other is kind of a lot of companies that are consumer facing, I think, still have a sense of a reputational benefit that comes from cleaning up supply chains. And a lot of companies still do that. It's interesting. We had this climate disclosure rule that the SEC proposed under the Biden administration that got scratched basically by the Trump administration. It's been formally killed, basically pulled back, that would have had companies just disclose their climate impacts so that other companies could know, right? To your point, like, well, what's a dirty part of my supply chain? What's a clean part? That rule had huge amounts of support from all companies across so many different sectors, obviously big opposition from oil and gas and coal. And part of it's just, hey, look, I want to clean up my supply chain for lots of my own reasons, to maintain market share, to be, have a good brand reputation, maybe to improve my efficiency, whatever the reason may be. And so you saw still like a corporate appetite for doing so. But now that the regulations being pulled back, you're going to have to see this happening in kind of a one-to-one B2B or business to business kind of conversations, which are happening, which are going to continue to happen. But it gets harder without the coordinated effort that government can provide. So I think you're still going to see that. You still got lots of companies that are committed to doing so. The tariff story is going to make that much more complicated. But in some cases, it might make it easier because lots of things that we might have sourced from abroad may not have adhered to a high standard that we have here. So buying American could help in that respect. But in a lot of cases, it's about, efficiently producing something that if it takes us more energy to produce, well, that's not better for the climate and environment. So it is a mixed bag on that front. But I'm still optimistic on kind of the element of how a lot of corporations can continue to commit to some of these goals that you just have to call them by another name, but there's still an advantage to the bottom line and to a long-term future for their companies.
Well, I feel like that's another role that consumers have to play. And as Cesar Chavez said, every dollar that we spend is a vote. So if we are voting with our dollars for cleaner products, then that is a positive. And of course, a dollar not spent on a dirty product is also a vote. So we have that opportunity. Let's kind of focus back down to, the listener level as to what listeners can do to really make an impact. What are the maybe 3 to 5 things that you would advise, or kind of high impact activities that everyday people can do?
I think the first, I mean, this is a great way to think about things. And especially, me as a political scientist, I think the really number one impact for individuals is in the policy process, in the political process, to participate in politics, to, vote for the kinds of climate forward parties, candidates at the hyper local level, at the federal level, right? That voting and volunteering for campaigns and all of the different, elements of the political participation spectrum are some of the most important things you can do as an individual, because the policy at the end of the day has such a big impact. And so the thinking about shaping the policy process via elections, right, is going to can have a tremendous impact. And that is hard, because if you think about, well, my vote, one vote doesn't matter. And it's like, look, your vote does matter, and your organization of many votes can matter, and you're campaigning for people who may not be voting and may not be registered to vote. That stuff matters a lot. And so that, to me, is, items number 1, 2, and 3. And in fact, I'm borrowing a lot of this from my good friend and colleague here, Leah Stokes, who's written a lot about this, which is that this goes far beyond the individual level changes. Like, yes, it's good to, reduce your consumption. It's good to improve your energy efficiency, weatherizing your home, for example, electrification of your home, solar plus battery. All of that's important too. But because of the huge impact that politics has, that can play a much bigger role. It also, it speaks to moving the blame a little bit. It's not any individual's fault for, a lot of the climate issues that we are facing. And we've talked so much about, the oil and gas sector, and talked about methane emissions. We've talked about the climate impacts of national oil companies. And, this is not a problem that individuals, because of their habits, have created. We know that. And so how do we push for the kinds of policies and changes that can try to tackle the head of the problem, rather than each individually trying to undertake what can be sometimes painful, shifts in behavior? But engaging in the political process, that's something that we can be doing, we should be doing, whatever your, perspective may be, but getting more engaged can be kind of the big, big, big thing. I think it's interesting that what you said about Al Gore in particular. Like, it's wild that he wasn't being his authentic self, I think, in that campaign in 2000. He has a remarkable ability to communicate with people. And if it was that Al Gore, I think it would have been a whole different story. And, his climate reality project right now, and his way of how he's training, the next generation of climate communicators. And so authenticity is something that I think we're valuing a lot more now. And rather than the, curated, management consultanted kind of platform that I think, unfortunately, Vice President Harris got pigeonholed into, not to mention the very short campaign. But, authenticity, there's something to be said about that. And that resonates with voters.
A little bit too much advertising Madison Avenue stuff versus just give us the straight scoop and really speak from your heart. So thank you so much for being on the show. Love, follow you going forward, and tell the audience how they can connect with you and support the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate this again, Matt, and all the work that you're doing. This is the climate communication, right? I mean, this is a key part of it. Folks who want to find me, I'm at paashamahdavi.com. Our initiative is at 2035 initiative. So 2035 initiative, all one word, .com. And then I have my lab as well. And you can look at the website, and I'm on Blue Sky for those interested. I'm at paashamahdavi.com. So, lots of places to find me on the internet for the folks that are interested, and happy to connect with anybody in your audience.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And kudos to you for the great work that you're doing, and look forward to collaborating with you as we move forward.
Likewise. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thank you. To learn more about our work at A Climate Change and how you can help us reach our goal planting 30,000 trees in the Amazon this year, visit aclimatechange.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. See you next time.